the northern Ural Mountains, Soviet Union. The 26th of February, 1959. Two volunteer searchers are working up a bare slope in fading light on the route their missing classmates planned to take a month before. Near the top of the slope, half buried in wind-packed snow, they find a tent. The canvas has been slashed open. Inside, everything is strangely in order. 9 rucksacks, 9 pairs of boots, warm jackets, still folded, slices of salted pork laid out on a cloth, uneaten, a camera with the film wound partway through. The stove is cold, no one is home. Below the tent, pressed into the crust and preserved by 3 weeks of wind, footprints led downhill toward the forest. 8, perhaps 9 sets, walking side by side at an even pace. Most were made by feet wearing only socks. The tracks run on for half a kilometer and fade. That evening, back at camp, the searchers pass around a flask of medical alcohol found among the group's supplies, and nobody proposes a toast. In the morning, the real search begins. The Dyatlov Pass incident is one of the most retold mysteries of the 20th century, and it has earned the title. In late January 1959, 10 young ski hikers, most of them students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnical Institute, set out from Sverdlovsk, the city now called Yekaterinburg, into the mountains of the northern Urals. 1 turned back sick. The other 9 died together in the night, on an open mountainside, in circumstances that investigators, scientists, and 60 years of writers have struggled to explain. They cut their way out of their own tent and walked into the dark without their boots. What was found on that slope over the following months turned a mountaineering accident into something else entirely, a case with radiation in it, lights in the sky above it, and a name on the map that reads like a warning. They were not amateurs, and they were not strangers to each other. Igor Dyatlov, 23, was a radio engineering student who built his own equipment and had led treks through these mountains before. Zinaida Kolmogoreova, 22, was among the Institute's most experienced hikers, remembered by classmates as the energetic center of any group she joined. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, had been accidentally shot on an earlier expedition, recovered, and signed up for more. Rustam Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonishenko, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibaut Brignol, and one outsider, Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, a decorated veteran of the Second World War, working as a trekking instructor. We know them because they wrote themselves down. A shared diary, several private ones, 4 cameras whose film survived. The photographs show a trip that looks like any student trip, clowning for the lens, ski tracks through birch forest, faces crowded around a stove. Slobodin mailed a last postcard from the village of Vizhy. Kolmogoreova wrote a last letter home. And on the 28th of January, at an abandoned settlement called Second Northern, the 10th member of the group, Yuri Udin, woke with joint pain too severe to continue, hugged his friends, and turned back. He would spend the rest of his life as the man who lived. The route began on the 23rd of January by train north out of Sverdlovsk, singing in the carriage, by the group's own account. Then a truck to Vizhy, the last inhabited village. Then skis. Their photographs track the days, the night of the 27th in a hut abandoned by a geological expedition, the 31st climbing the valley of the Ozpia River, where they cached food and spare gear for the return leg. Ahead of them stood the mountain the Man-si call Kholat-si-Akhl, the mountain of the dead. 9 Man-si hunters died on its slopes long ago, the old stories say, and the mountain has kept its count ever since. And the peak the group was aiming for carried a darker name still, Otorten. Do not go there. 9 hikers, skiing toward the mountain of the dead, bound for do not go there. On the 1st of February, they climbed toward the shoulder of Kholat-si-Akhl, and the weather closed in. Rather than lose altitude, they set camp on the open eastern slope, about 300 meters below the summit, cutting a platform into the snow the way the manuals taught. The last frames on their film show exactly that, falling snow, dim light, and 9 people digging in for an ordinary hard night. That evening, someone in the tent wrote out a sheet of camp jokes, a mock newspaper titled The Evening Otorten, Nothing in their own record is unusual. That is the last thing the record says. The group was expected to wire home from Vijay around the 12th of February. Nothing came. Sport clubs in that era ran on trust and slow telegraph lines, and days passed before anyone treated the quiet as an emergency. By the 20th, the families were demanding action, and search parties of student volunteers, soldiers, and local Sea hunters went into the mountains with aircraft overhead. On the 26th of February, they found the tent, and the case began with an inventory. The tent had been cut open from the inside. A forensic expert, Henrietta Chorkina, examined the seams and confirmed it. The slashes came from within, made by someone cutting their own way out through the canvas. Everything the 9 needed to survive was still inside. Boots, quilted jackets, hats, the stove, their money, their papers. The footprints told the rest. 8 or 9 people had left together, in a line, in socks or barefoot, down into a night of -25 degrees. And here is the detail that has kept people awake for 60 years. The prints were calm. Nobody runs from nothing, and nobody walks away from their only shelter. Yet the tracks say they walked. Searchers followed them to a tall cedar at the forest edge, 1.5 kilometers away. Under it were the remains of a small fire, and beside the fire, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko in their underwear, dead of cold. Branches on the cedar were snapped off 5 meters up, where someone had climbed again and again to look back at the slope. Over the following days, searchers found 3 more of the group on the open slope between the cedar and the tent. Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogoreova, and Rustem Slobodin lay hundreds of meters apart, in postures suggesting they were climbing back toward the tent when they fell. All 3 had frozen. Then, for 2 months, the mountain gave up nothing. The last 4 were found on the 4th of May, under 4 meters of snow, in a ravine 75 meters past the cedar, in a hollowed-out den floored with cut branches. What the autopsy table recorded there changed everything. Nikolai Tabo-Brignol's skull was fractured. Semyon Zolotaryov and Lyudmila Dubinina had rows of broken ribs and massive internal injuries. The forensic examiner, Boris Vozrozhdiony, wrote that the force involved was comparable to a car crash and that it had left almost no marks on the skin. Dubinina's tongue and her eyes were missing. At the funerals in Sverdlovsk, thousands filed past the open caskets, and the whispers began at the graveside. The skin of the dead had turned a deep brick orange, mourners said. Their hair, families murmured, had gone grey in a single night. Then the file grew stranger still. Radiological tests, ordered late in the investigation and never publicly explained, found radiation on clothing of the dead. And witnesses across the region that winter, meteorologists and soldiers among them, reported glowing orange orbs drifting across the night sky. Another party of hikers, camped far to the south, saw them too that same February. In May of 1959, the investigation closed with a finding that explained nothing. The group, it ruled, had died from a compelling natural force. The file did not say which force. It was stamped, classified, and locked away. The mountains around the pass were closed to travelers for 3 years, and the state never said another word. A vague sentence, a sealed archive, and 9 graves. A sealed file is a story with the last page torn out, and everyone who heard it wrote their own. In Sverdlovsk, the whispers started before the ground thawed. Students noticed men at the funerals nobody could place. Word went around that searchers had been made to sign secrecy papers, and out of the whispers grew the theories, each one fitting a piece the others could not. There was the film. The last roll from the group's cameras ends on a blurred frame, a dark shape, upright, between snow-covered trees. To those who enlarged it and stared, it looked like nothing human, and the Sea have old words for the giants that walk these forests. Half a century later, an American television special would introduce that frame to the world as a Russian Yeti. There were the weapons, the orange orbs, the radiation, crushed chests without a mark on the skin. To Cold War mines it added up. Parachute mines tested in the night sky, their blast waves killing from a distance. Yuri Kuntsevich, who stood at those funerals as a 12-year-old boy and grew up to found the Dyatlov Foundation, defended that theory for the rest of his life. There were the spies. In the 1990s, the writer Alexei Rakitin read the same file and saw a KGB operation, members of the group delivering fake atomic secrets to American agents on a mountainside, a handover gone wrong, a massacre dressed as an accident. In his telling, the radioactive clothing was the bait itself. There was the mountain. The American filmmaker Donnie Eichar spent years on the case and came back with something stranger than any spy infrasound. Wind coiling off the dome of Kholat Syakhl at a frequency below human hearing, flooding 9 rational minds with wordless panic until they cut their way out of their own tent. A monster, a weapon, a betrayal, or the mountain itself, humming at a pitch no one can hear. For 60 years, every one of them fit, and not one of them could be ruled out. The file stayed closed. That is the legend, as 60 years have told it. It has a monster, a weapon, a betrayal, and a cursed mountain. What it has never had is the file. Open the file. Start with the name, because the name was never a warning. In Mansi, Kholat Syakhl means dead mountain the way a hunter means it, barren, no game, nothing worth the climb. The mountain of the dead is a translation that improved with every retelling. The tale of 9 dead Mansi hunters appears in no Mansi source anyone has produced. It travels from paperback to paperback, always second-hand. And Otor 10, the peak that supposedly warns "do not go there," means nothing at all. Russian map makers mislabeled it generations ago with a garbled name borrowed from a different mountain. The warnings on the map were written by map makers and mystery writers. The Mahansi are in the file in a different role. In the first weeks, investigators treated them as suspects. Herders questioned, a sacred storage platform searched. The file records their clearing in plain terms. The only footprints on the slope belonged to the hikers. Nothing was taken, and the injuries matched no human attack. The same Mansi hunters had guided the search from the start, and it was their reading of the tracks the searchers trusted. The autopsy answered more than the legend admits, and it answered in 1959. Dubinina's missing tongue and eyes were recorded by Vozrozhdiony as loss after death, the ordinary work of 3 months of running snow melt on soft tissue. The orange skin and the grey hair that horrified the funerals is what 3 months of wind, cold, and slow mummification does. Both findings have been in the file from the beginning. The radiation shrinks under the same light. Beta traces on a sweater and trouser cuffs, not on bodies, and mostly on the clothes of Georgy Krivonishenko, who worked at the Mayak plutonium complex and had been sent into the cleanup of the 1957 Kish team disaster, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, and at the time a state secret. Contaminated work clothing was a hazard of his job. Case archivists such as Teodora Hajiska still debate the exact pattern of those traces, and the debate is honest. But clothing is not a body, and the inquest knew whose clothing it was. Witnesses did see lights in the sky. Their reports sat in the file until the lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, admitted in 1990 that he had been ordered to bury them, and researchers since have matched the sightings to something the Soviet Union could not mention: early rocket launches arcing over the Urals from the new test ranges. And the figure in the trees? Step back from the enlargement, and most researchers see a hiker, one of the 9, walking ahead of the camera on an ordinary afternoon. The Dyatlov Foundation, which speaks for the families, condemned the television special that turned him into a monster. Strip the myths away, though, and the true mystery still stands untouched. Something drove 9 disciplined people out of a warm tent into a lethal night, and for 60 years no correction ever answered that. Then quietly, the ending changed. In 2019, at the family's request, the Russian Prosecutor General's office reopened the case. It reviewed the theories and kept only the natural ones. On the 11th of July 2020, Prosecutor Andrei Koryakov announced the conclusion. A slab of compacted snow had released above the tent in the dark. The group cut their way out, moved down to the tree line the way mountaineering practice dictated, meaning to return, and could not find the tent again through wind and darkness. It was, he said, a heroic struggle. There was no panic, but they had no chance. 6 months later, 2 scientists gave that account its physics. Johann Gomi, head of the Snow Avalanche Laboratory at EPFL in Switzerland, and Alexander Puzrin of ETH Zurich published a peer-reviewed model in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment, showing how a small, delayed slab release could produce everything the file describes. The slope above the tent, measured later by drone, is locally steeper than 30 degrees. Winds pouring off the summit kept loading snow above the cut the group had made when they dug in their platform. Hours after the shovels stopped, a slab about the size of a car could let go. Their simulation of its impact on bodies lying on a rigid bed of skis reproduces the pattern of the injuries: broken ribs, fractured skulls, almost nothing on the skin. To model the snow itself, Gomi adapted animation code written for the Disney film Frozen. The authors were careful about their claim. "We do not claim to have solved the mystery," Gomi told reporters. Then the mountain answered for them. In the 2 winters after publication, follow-up expeditions photographed and filmed slab avalanches on the slopes of the pass itself in exactly the conditions the model requires. For 60 years, the deadliest objection to the avalanche theory was that no one had ever seen one there. Now there are photographs. Weigh it the way the file deserves, as 3 separate questions. Did something force the 9 out of the tent? Did something kill 4 of them with crushing force? And did the state hide something? On the first 2, the case for the slab is now strong. It explains the cut tent, because a buried tent's exits are useless. It explains the calm, even footprints, because walking to the tree line in formation is what trained hikers were taught to do on a slope that has just failed. It explains the injuries through a low, dense mass striking people pinned against a rigid bed of skis, breaking ribs and skulls while barely marking skin. And it now has photographs of slabs on the same slopes. The case against deserves its full weight. The searchers of 1959, experienced mountaineers among them, reported no avalanche debris, and part of the tent still stood. Nobody has fully explained why the retreat ran 1.5 kilometers instead of a few hundred meters, or why people who reached a working fire and a dug shelter did not live until morning. The families and the case's own archivists remain unconvinced, and they say so publicly. On the 3rd question, the record answers plainly, and the answer was already on the table. The Sphere reports Ivanov was ordered to bury. The secrecy the searchers remembered, the reflex of a system that treated every dead citizen as an internal matter. There was concealment. What there is no evidence of, anywhere in the file, is a stranger cause behind it. As for the mines, the spies, and the humming mountain, the slab needs none of them, and none of them ever produced a document, a fragment, or a name. So, the verdict: the monster, the mutilation, the radioactive dead, the cursed mountain. The file answered each of them, most within months, some within weeks, and the answers sat in an archive while the legend grew without them. What remains is harder and sadder. 9 capable people, a slope holding a rare trap, a slab of wind-packed snow about the size of a car, and a night cold enough to close every door behind them. A state investigation, modern physics, and photographs from the pass itself now agree on the shape of that night, and the disagreement that survives lives mostly where no model can go, the exact order of events, the reason the retreat went so far, the last hours in the den, in the ravine. The legend, in the end, grew less from the mountain than from the file. A verdict that named a force and refused to describe it left a blank space in the official record, and readers did what readers do with blank spaces in official records. For a generation, filling that space was how the story stayed alive. The 9 left a better record. An ordinary trip documented with care by people who expected to come home. The rest was written into their margins by everyone who came after. Most of the 9 lie together at the Mikhailovskoye Cemetery in Yekaterinburg beneath a shared memorial that carries their photographs. The saddle where they died now appears on every map as Dyatlov Pass. It is named for them, not for what happened to them. Yuri Yudin, who turned back at 2nd Northern and spent 54 years asking why he was spared, died in 2013. He is buried with his friends. If you want more stories from the edge of the map, subscribe and we will see you on the next one.